Thank you. Let's start by making sure that the online panelists are there and can be unmuted.
I think I'm
Barbara?
Yes.
Barbara? Yes, Massimo?
I am.
Yay, excellent, excellent. Okay, so fingers crossed that we don't have any technical issues in this session at least. All right, so welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to the discussion of how bad are annotation disagreements really. And I am very excited to be here with this very fitting crowd. They are all computational linguists. They have all done plenty of work on annotation in all kinds and tasks and kinds of data. So let me start by introducing Margot Mieskes, and she's a professor for information science at the University of Applied Sciences, Darmstadt. She has worked extensively in summarization, and she's one of those people who just makes the field, the community better by both doing research and publishing, and also by organizing workshops and tutorials on methodology, including replicability and ethics and teaching NLP and peer review. So welcome, Margot. Our next in alphabetical order panelist is Barbara Plank, who we already had the pleasure of listening to this morning. And Barbara is the new chair of AI and Computational Linguistics and LMU Munich. And thankfully, she remains part-time with us in Copenhagen at IT University of Copenhagen, where she continues to lead the very productive and successful NLP North group. She has an incredibly wide body of work on multiple areas of computational linguistics, and my personal favorite is her work, including surveys and research papers, which basically try to define terms which we take for granted, such as domain and genre and universal and relation extraction. With that, she has already expressed some of her, she has already mentioned some of her work on annotation disagreements in the morning session, and I'm very excited to hear more. So welcome to Barbara. And the next in alphabetical order is Massimo Poesio, and he's a professor in computational linguistics, Queen Mary University of London. And among many other things, he has published in both computational linguistics and cognitive science. And he has a very impressive body of work on coreference and semantic annotation, especially using games with a purpose. And I'd like to just mention his new book, Statistical Methods for Annotation Analysis, which is a great reason to be here. So thank you, Massimo. And last but not least, we have Bonnie Weber, and you can't not have heard who she is. So this is an honorary professor of intelligent systems at the Institute for Language, Cognition and Computation at the University of Edinburgh. She is a lifetime award recipient at ACL 2020. She is a living legend and generally a wonderful human being. And I guess she is best known for her huge work on discourse, including the original Pan discourse tree rank. So welcome, Bonnie. So with that, I guess let's start with one point that we can all agree on, and that is that there's a pretty widespread perception in NLP community that low annotation agreement somehow equals bad data. And I was very happy to hear Yejin Choi mention that in one of the keynotes. So do you generally agree with that perception? And if not, what are some of the examples of language data for which agreement will be low no matter what? I'd like to start.
Okay. My 1 minute response.
Oh. All right.
That you were doing 1 minute now, or do you want?
All right. Yes, I'm a very bad session chair, and it completely skipped my mind to give you all a chance to do some opening remarks on the general topic of the panel. So would anybody like to do that now?
Okay, I'll give a general opening remark, because one thing that was not made specific, and it usually is not made specific is what stage of knowledge of the phenomena you're doing the annotation at. And mostly I've been involved with annotation and corpus creation when we think we know what's going on, but we're prepared to discover new things. And in that condition, I think it's not surprising when you get annotator disagreement, and it doesn't mean bad data. It means that we've got to learn a bit more about the phenomena that we're annotating before we go forward. So I'm sure that's a general, that people agree with that. I just thought I'd bring it up, and then we can continue on that vein.
Thank you, Bonnie. Who'd like to pick up?
Who should we?
Go ahead, Massimo.
Shall I just go? Yes. I think Bonnie is right. I guess I've also been primarily working on data in which there are some theoretical issues, but so it seems to me that the point is that, well, there can be cases of disagreement which are due to poorly defined annotation schemes or annotation schemes for phenomena that we don't know very well. But there are also cases in which, I mean, the cases I've been mostly working on are cases of anaphoric reference, the simplest cases of anaphoric reference in which you know perfectly well what you're supposed to do, but in fact, it's difficult to tell from the data what the interpretation is. So over the years, we've been doing lots of experiments, and when you start asking more than 2 or 3 people, especially people who you haven't pre-trained to death to agree with you, then you start seeing that, you know, some people choose one interpretation, some other people choose another interpretation. And so and these are for fairly simple cases. And then there are cases which actually I wasn't really very aware of until recently, but there are all sorts of cases of subjective language use. So if you're asking people whether they find a bit of text funny or offensive or misogynistic, then you're going to find a lot of disagreement. And there it doesn't really matter. Again, it's not a question of annotation scheme. It's a question, and this seems to me the cases for which it's less plausible to imagine that you could, because for an anaphoric reference, you could always say, well, okay, maybe the intended interpretation you should try to recover, but for subjective judgments of that type, they're just different views, and it doesn't matter on the annotation scheme.
All right, shall I go next? All right, so yeah, thanks a lot. As you've seen already, if you have been here in my talk this morning, I'm a strong believer that there is more to be learned by looking at these disagreement cases and embracing them. But I would like to add another point which I haven't highlighted this morning, and that's we typically take, you know, we are aiming, or we are obsessed with disagreement scores, and we want to reach this kind of magic level in order to be able to publish a data set or everything, you know, what follows. But in a way, what I think we are lacking is instead of, you know, we're looking only at the product in the end of annotation, of the process of going to get this data set or modeling this phenomena. But I think there is a lot to be more gained. I'm also looking more on the process and thinking of new ways to learn more about the annotation process by looking beyond just the labels themselves. I think there's very exciting directions also into this sphere. So maybe I want to bring this up. Thanks.
Yeah, so as was apparent from my talk, I've been doing a lot in summarization. And I think actually summarization is one of those cases where having subjective annotations is actually a good thing, because everyone sees a summary as different, but they're all valid. And so we will have a hard time getting high inter-annotator agreement there. And I remember being a young PhD student, I was very frustrated because the numbers were so low and everyone was saying, we have to have higher scores and everything. And I was like, but I don't get them. But that's actually not something to despair. That's something to embrace and maybe learn something about how do we do actually task X. So for example, summarization, what is going on there? And not to be fixated on a single number.
Thank you all very much. Just to immediately catch on your final point. So there is this kind of expectation of high agreement when we publish resource papers. And it seems to me that it is kind of driven by this metric optimization mindset, which we also see in modeling papers. So just like a high F1 or accuracy would be a measure of success for a model, then a large data set plus high agreement is an indicator of a good, a lazy indicator of a good resource paper. And if you don't have that, then it's hard to publish. So would you agree that we kind of start approaching publishing of resources in the same way that we approach publishing of models? And if so, then what can we do about that? Like we try to optimize for high agreement. We sometimes just throw out data that doesn't agree.
I mean, if I can just pick up on what I just said, I think that's where interesting questions start. So if you have high agreement and you build a model on that, then it's one number in your paper, right? So your paper is about something, and then you just report this one number and you say, okay, I have reliable annotation, so can tick it off. But when you have a low agreement, you always have to ask, okay, why is that the case? Were my annotators not very good? Was my task too hard? Was it ill-defined? What is the issue? Is the task in itself somewhat picky or tricky or whatever? And so I think that's where the interesting part starts in this whole annotation procedure, or in this whole discussion of annotation.
So one of the things with the work on summarization and in generation is that you tend to give 4 scores, sometimes 5 scores. And so you can look individually at the different kinds of scores to see what kind of agreement you get. And I think that's really very important. It's not something that we've done, but I was thinking about that with respect to the discourse connectives that we've been annotating, and realized that some of them are really easy because they're not ambiguous. This ambiguity that we don't notice until the last minute, but there are ones that are easier than others. And I think this idea of selectively identifying the agreement of annotators on different parts of the task certainly makes for publishable papers, and it drives things forward to say, why are we so bad on these and not something else? So I just wanted to add that to what you had said about summarization.
Can I go next, or somebody else would? Yeah, no. So I think I agree with both of those points. So it seems to me that also there is two separate issues. So one issue is, I think we will come to later, is this to which extent you can use coefficients of agreement to measure or to be the only metric of quality. And yeah, so I don't really believe that that's something that they're useful, but you need there are methods to give you more information. And the other point is that, yeah, so it seems to me there is a tension, right, between what objectives of your, a lot of work in NLP is not so much about pushing forward the boundaries of what we know about language. Is more about, okay, so this is a phenomenon that we know fairly well. How can we model the interpretation processes? But so, and for that kind of work, then yes, so you want to have fairly clear phenomena. But there is a lot of, certainly in the areas that I work on, there is a lot still that is unknown. So in a sense, again, going back to the point that Bonnie was making, it's sort of like unavoidable that part of the work is really to understand better. So you start seeing, okay, so we have these disagreements here, and so we get how can we improve things? How can we develop our theories? And it would be nice if that kind of work was considered that, you know, publishable by the community. It's not always easy. I agree.
Yeah, right. So as of these two metrics, I completely agree with Massimo that we have this tension here, right? On the one side, the metrics that we want to, you know, we want to have good models and improve our models for whatever downstream task. But on the other hand, they rely on the data. And so that there is this implicit assumption, in fact, that the annotator agreements give us the quality we seek in order to prove good models. But I, you know, in fact, this is just this agreement score as we use to do it, or you usually do it. It's 1 point estimate. It's one number that we are trying to put a lot of different things into, right? It measures one number, but there are so many factors into that we usually don't look at. And we are striving to just have this number so that we can go on to the modeling typically, rather than focusing more on the data. And the interesting part that also Margot was saying, it's very interesting to look at the questions and the difficulties of certain instances or properties of the data, which I think, you know, by going, we should not just focus on agreement when publishing resource papers. We need to really give the reader of a resource paper why is this first of all an interesting data set, a motivation, but also information about what went into this process. Like just even label distributions, maybe you could think of new ways to visualize the data sets. Cartography comes in mind even, right? Some new ways of gaining insights into what we have at hand. I think there's a lot to be done in this direction still that can be going beyond just, you know, this kind of barrier that we need to have a certain agreement score. On top of that, I want to just mention that, you know, sometimes we also don't think that this disagreement scores come from other community, if I'm right. Maybe Massimo knows even more, but this comes a lot also from Krippendorf and media studies. And they are looking, you know, they want to have good coding, reliable coding to make hypotheses or to falsify hypotheses in a very different way than when you go and apply machine learning on. So where a small change or disagreement might have a huge impact, which in an ML world might not be so, you know, or we need to know essentially more of the data to understand the disagreement. I'm not sure. Sorry, I stop here. I make too many points.
Thank you so much. I guess to follow up on the issue of metric, there's a lot of discussion in also modeling and engineering papers at the moment, whether even the way we estimate our performance is methodologically sound and whether these are the right numbers to optimize for. So with respect to internal data agreement too, we have a couple of standard metrics that everybody uses, such as kappa and Krippendorf alpha. Would you say that this is always done the right way? And if no, like any do's and don'ts, especially for any students that might be watching this? And I'm going to call on Margot to start.
Okay. Well, one thing, I started to look into internal data agreement during my PhD, of course. And what I actually did, and I think that was very insightful for me, I took a small portion of my annotation and I actually started to calculate the measures by hand, because that actually gave me an insight into what is going on. Is it actually plausible? What is the result? And I've seen a couple of implementation, for example, where there were some weird errors in there. So I think it would be important to do a sanity check on whether it's actually plausible that the inter-annotator agreement is the way it is. And for that, and especially when you are new to this whole thing, taking a small example and actually going back to the math and just doing it by hand on a piece of paper, I found very insightful, although it's very old-fashioned, I agree.
Who'd like to continue?
Do you want to take somebody from the metasphere or something, or do you want? Okay. We're talking about more than one thing, and it's clear from the fact that Margot has done summarization, and there are other tasks where you're choosing a single label, and we're talking about annotators choosing different labels. But summarization has dimensions of variation where you're looking at, and even when you're just labeling, there's a difference between a task where you can choose any number of labels, because the idea is not that the labels are contradictory, that they partition some space, and they are different from another. But we also need to talk about the kinds of errors, and it's not so much an error as an inconsistency between the choices made by the annotators. So I bring this up because a lot of the kinds of differences that we've observed with annotating the discourse connectives is a difference in how many different things the annotators can see, senses being conveyed by the utterance. So I think we should distinguish between annotation where the annotators differ about which choice of one thing they're making versus whole interconnections of choices in the summarization, because they're clearly dependent on each other. So it's not like you could check this off and then check something else off, because the way the summarization for this was done depends on what was earlier. So maybe we could be a bit more clear about what kinds of disagreements or inconsistencies we're getting between the annotators.
Point. Who in the metaverse would like to continue?
Well, I could say something. We just published a book on these some of these topics. Actually, I'm not sure if it's exactly the best intro for a student, but yeah. So there's just two issues. Well, first of all, the coefficients of agreement. They're very useful. So you can really see why people are using them, even though not as widely as one would imagine. And there has been progress so there is now new metrics that were not available, like when we did the survey a few years back. But so they're useful, but there are a number of issues, and at least two types of issues. So from the first type of issue is that, well, there were this nice series of papers by Carletta Reinsma a few years ago that were sort of like pointing out that the kind of disagreement that is captured through these coefficients of agreement is not, even if you're not interested at all in the linguistic phenomenon, you're purely interested from a machine learning perspective. So the coefficients of agreement, they do not discriminate between different types of disagreement, so what they call noise and bias. And so you may end up having cases in which you have low disagreement, but actually the data are annotated in a way that, because it's just a random noise, so the machine learning algorithm can pick up. And there are other cases in which you have relatively high agreement, but it's not, the data are not usable. So that's one issue. And from a more annotation oriented point of view, I really think that the methods such as these probabilistic annotation models, which were pioneered by Carpenter and then Becky Passonneau and Bob Carpenter had this nice paper in Tackle a few years back. They're much more informative about what's actually going on. Sorry, Rebecca Bruce and Janice Weeb as well. So they don't simply give you a one number, but they tell you, okay, so among the labels, so which labels actually can be identified reliably, so which items are hard to annotate, which annotators. So they give you a much more complete picture of, and so from the point of view of trying to understand what's going on, so again, from a linguistic perspective, at least. So I find them much more informative. Yeah, so I would really recommend everybody, and these are fairly straightforward to use in most cases.
All right, maybe I add a little bit another angle to this. I feel it's hard to talk about, just agreement scores per se. I think it's important to see them in light of the task you're trying to solve. A little bit connected to what Bonnie said, because they very, we have binary labeling tasks, or trying to find something or not, something binary tasks, but we also have a lot of these multinomial tasks where we pick one out of the many choices, but then the agreement measures can be very influenced by the skewness of the distribution, right? If you think about the NER task where you have a lot of O labels, which, is also part of but you don't want to measure that. And then the whole other story goes if you go into more complex modeling tasks where there is not just a set of labels, but there's a set of relations or structures that you want to task where these measures are also not very directly applicable. So I think there's a lot of, this is a huge topic and it's a very complex topic. And I think it's important to keep in mind that, Cohen's kappa, as we usually introduce it in teaching on maybe sentiment analysis, can become very complex if you think about agreement statistics for dependency path trees and structured objects. So maybe that's my additional input on this.
Couldn't agree more. I guess to ask a very provocative question. So suppose you can start anew in a fresh new world with a fresh, completely new set of peer reviewers who you don't have to worry about. And you can come up with a new way to describe and report resources and data sets. Would that version of resource or data set paper that you would write, would it include agreement, or would you rather do it in some other way? And if so, how? The floor is yours. Maybe, Bonnie, would you like to start?
I can't figure out what the question is.
Oh, should we maybe think of a different way to present and describe data and resource work? Would you, if you could, would you rather do something other than internal data agreement to describe the data? Or, and if so, how?
I don't have an answer to that right away, so let me think about it.
Okay. Margot, what about you?
Okay, so I think inter-annotator agreement is just one dimension of many when you report on resources. And also, as has been said in previous comments, just one measure, especially if you have a multidimensional annotation. So it's not just binary, like it's important or not, but it can be one of X categories. It would be important to also look into those details. It would also be important to look into individual annotators, but that's just the annotation part. But a data set is much more than just the annotation. It's how the data was collected. What is the data underlying it? What is the question why I collected this data? What is the research question behind collecting a specific data set? What do I want to achieve with this? And I think those are a lot more that go a lot deeper and more detail than just saying, okay, I have this number of data points, I have this number of agreement, I have this number of annotators, and yeah, that's just the table, that's just the statistics, sorry. And I think it would be also important to say more about the motivation, the background, the goal, the aim, and the content of the data.
What about Barbara?
Yeah, this is so Margot, thanks. This is great. Well said. I couldn't agree more. It's the whole package which is important and not just the agreement scores. But still, it's a good question, right? What else would you like to see? Or in a way, I also interpret your question as would we go for abandoning even agreement scores in a way, which is a difficult question. I do think that while I advocate for looking more into this human variation in labeling, which is important. An important underlying assumption is that we do have genuine variation. So what I think, on the other hand, what we should try to avoid is that people go and say, use crowdsourcing to collect labels for whatever task they're interested in, and then there is no kind of quality check whatsoever, so that we are essentially trying to promote, disagreement is good, whatever disagreement there is. We should try to avoid we should try to make sure that it focuses on the question, and there are some, quality checks that we can be sure that what we are actually collecting makes sense. Not sure what I want to, I want to say that advocating on the one hand for embracing variability should not be this blue, this pass to do whatever you want, essentially, that we need some sort of quality. But I don't think like just agreement score alone is enough for making sure to reach this quality level. It's about the whole process again of creating the data set, how to collect the data, how to hire the annotators. Many tasks we can't crowdsource, and I believe we can never crowdsource. So we need to document that more. I think we are sometimes too fixed on the table that Margot mentioned. We want to get this table in the paper, while there are so many interesting things that can happen in the process, which I'm sure all of you have seen, right? If you try even to do agreement over time, you expect it to grow, but no, if you do annotation, it's actually sometimes looking a little bit like up and down. And this depends on so many factors, like sample what you get, or again, you change the labels, and it's not really strictly comparable to the previous round, and all this sort of information. I think it's important to push more towards publishing more insights on the process itself. That would be my kind of takeaway.
Absolutely. Massimo, would you like to add anything?
I don't think there's much to add to what Margot and Barbara already said. Yeah, so I wouldn't say that we already have because again, so the advantage of the coefficients of agreement is that we just borrow these methodologies from the content analysts, and so we sort of like adopted what they were doing. But now we're trying to go beyond that, and I think we all feel that you need something more sophisticated. I wouldn't say that we already have something which is so well developed as that. But yeah, so it seems to me that clearly, again, so I think that I really like the Passonneau and Carpenter paper, because they try to see how you could use this kind of methodologies to get a better insight on, okay, so this is our corpus, and this is our, for all the annotators, what they were confused on, and so which items were easy, which items were hard. But that's a lot of data, right? So to actually find a way of maybe what Barbara was saying before, okay, maybe we need this way of visualizing this kind of information in a way that makes it easy to understand. And also, again, so if it depends on what you're going to use the data for, whether you want to use them for, I mean, in a lot of cases, what we use is try to understand better the phenomenon. And so, okay, how are we going to change? But if you are somebody who are interested in building models, what do you do with all this information? I'm not, well, we're probably going to talk a little bit about training with data from Disagreement. But again, I think we are trying to find a methodology, but we're not quite there yet.
Thank you. And just to follow up a bit on the problem with reporting all these extra nice things, which we would like to see together with the data, such as, yes, more description of how and why, and with what kind of annotators the data was collected. One problem that I myself found when doing all that is that we have 8 pages in our conference submissions at best, and that works very well for modeling papers with methodology and a table of results. But if you want to actually go into some qualitative analysis, to do some serious data work, that's just not sufficient. So any creative ideas for working around that, or do we need a completely different venue?
Okay, I'm going to say something with respect to the previous question as well, because we didn't say anything about the data itself that that we were annotating. And when you're at most of the low-level things in linguistics that we're annotating, and I don't think it's the case with summarization, but maybe I'm wrong here, is that there really is a Zipfian distribution of the phenomena. So you really want to know not just annotator agreement and disagreement, but some kind of correlation between the particular subset of the phenomena that you're looking at, how frequent it is, and whether the annotators are getting it right, right or wrong. So I thought that was relevant, because some of the most unambiguous things in discourse are low frequency, but they're very reliable. So, you can say something in general about that. Now, with respect to your other question, I have to remind you that conferences are not the only possible way of publishing your results. And it is very frustrating for me, and I'm sure for everybody else here who has students, that students think that conference papers are the only way of publishing things. And you're right that there's more material that needs to be made available. So publish the size document that you need for your results, not shoehorning them into a conference paper.
But what venues do you think are realistic for this kind of work, for, let's say, a student grade project at the moment? So we have TACL, we have computational linguistics. What are the venues that you would recommend for this kind of work?
We also have a number of journals.
Yeah, so like TACL, computational linguistics, anything else?
Those are just the journals that are published by the ACL. Those are not all the journals. And if you're unhappy about that there isn't a journal for you, and that includes LRE for language resources and evaluation, it includes discourse and dialogue. There are
Thanks, Bonnie.
What's that?
Thank you, Bonnie, for that. Yes, definitely.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm just saying the obvious that hasn't been said already.
Yeah.
So I probably can't list everything right now, but there are venues. The question is how those are valued. And we've spent so much time trying to convince panels who are promotion panels for our younger colleagues that all of these conferences are really important, that they flip over and think only conferences are important and ignore the journals. So, part of our current situation is of our own making, and it's not specific to looking at data and annotation. But your question was very general, so I'm responding in a general way.
Yeah. No, exactly. So I am exactly with that. I guess so. In the UK, we have the additional pressure that it's often difficult to convince hiring panels in particular that conferences matter. So some places are better than others in that respect. So there is a lot of pressure to publish in journals. So that's, but yeah. So it seems to me that the obvious answer is that if you have a study which requires a more in-depth analysis that you can make in 8 pages, then you should go for a journal. The problem is that these journals are not necessarily widely known, or so yeah. So that is again a bit of yeah, a bit of the key issue. But otherwise, maybe I don't know. I've had very mixed results with trying to use these supplementary materials that you can sometimes add to. Nobody seems to read them, so I'm not sure if that's.
Actually, I want to add on that because this is one of my thoughts. In fact, we used a lot the supplement to also like a new corpus on skill extraction on job postings where we started to work in, and there were some data sets available, but no one published ever any annotation guidelines for this task. And so we contributed also the annotation guidelines that we implemented for this work over the last year. And I think at least some of that part there is space for this in the supplement, and it's also valuable to put in there, and all sorts of. It should be put in there in my view, or if it's very, very, you could even consider making a technical report as well. I know it is extra work, right? And maybe it doesn't look for a student to pay off right now, but if then people start using your resource, you will in the long run hear back for this valuable work, which maybe is not the publication, right? So I think it's still worth spending extra time on making resources more accessible, making annotation guidelines accessible for other people, which unfortunately is also not always the case. And in that sense, and then I also agree on journals as well, but it's always difficult with the time frame, but still think, or for metadata that you have, it's often just useful even to just push it in the repository and have a little README there, so on. There is additional information that you can release similarly to the raw agreements. I think there's value in this, even if it's not necessarily even part of the huge, maybe you have data that is not useful right now, but is useful down the line for someone even that you can put up. So it's not necessarily in the paper, but still valuable to put in the resource.
I just want to remind Barbara that when we started doing our little project, which was on the genre in the Penn Tree Bank, it wasn't until I had done much of it by hand that I discovered on the LDC website that we actually had an explicit listing because somebody had taken the time to go through the ACL-DCI corpus and align the two, which meant that there was an enormous amount of metadata. But the person who was in charge of the Penn Tree Bank didn't think that that was particularly interesting. So it never got, it was of course available because it was a link from the LDC website, but it hadn't been promoted. So I think what Barbara is saying is we do get the chance to promote the methodologies that we're using for particular data, and it's going to be useful for people. It was certainly useful for us. So just adding that.
Thank you.
And adding to there, Bonnie has a very nice 2009 paper on that published. Please go and read it.
Right.
Yeah, actually, so my first thought when I heard about this question was this page limitation actually comes from a time when these proceedings were actually printed. And if I imagine that these proceedings would be printed, I think you could kill someone with that. And whether it's still necessary to have these restrictions on a very general level, but I think that goes beyond what we are discussing here. So.
Thank you, indeed. All right, well, I have 2 more questions, but I shouldn't monopolize these amazing people. So would anybody in the audience like to ask a question, or in the Zoom? Any questions from the audience? Or I'm very happy to keep going.
There are three people who seem.
Oh, lots of hands up in Zoom. Okay. Let's go with Joe.
Actually, Nathan was first.
Oh, okay. Please go.
Okay, I typed up my questions for the chat, but I'll ask them orally as well. So thanks for the great panel, first of all. I was wondering about if there are scenarios where more research is needed on metrics for data quality. So I was thinking, for example, what if you only have access to one annotator? You know, maybe you're working on an endangered language. How can we evaluate that kind of data? Or what if the annotator isn't working in a vacuum, but they see some pre-annotation or they see some like suggestions from an algorithm? Chance agreement is going to be different in those scenarios. So does anyone know work on these types of things, or is this sort of an open area?
Well, I don't know of a lot of work in this area. The first issue I've seen a few times, people use stability instead of inter-annotator agreement, interreliability. So basically, you sample the same annotator at a distance of time to see whether their judgments are stable. So
so self-agreement.
Yeah, so self-agreement. It's clearly less informative than standard interreliability, but that's something that I've seen because I think Steve Bird did some work in that. And now the second part of the question, I wasn't completely sure I understood.
So if you have an algorithm making suggestions and the annotator sees the suggestions, then the chance level of agreement is going to be influenced by those suggestions. So do you know of any work in that sort of scenario?
No, but that's a great question, because that's certainly something that like for instance, in our games with a purpose, we are moving more and more towards that scenario, right? So you don't simply have ask them for judgments, but you do some sort of like a pre-annotation. So it would be interesting to see the extent to which that affects the results. Yeah, but I don't know. But I don't know of any work. But if you find anything, I would be very interested.
Okay, thanks. I'm trying to get my hands on your book, so that'll be a good survey.
But there's a lot of stability. And if you are interested in that, I don't know how useful it is. But...
maybe I can add to this. Actually, these are great questions, Nathan. Really, thanks. I just remember that there was this work for the second question on influence of pre-annotation, essentially. I think there was a work by Anna Kohonen and such. They did a study on pausing and what it means to have. I can try to find it back. There was a little bit, but I'm sure there is more on that side. Like,
yeah, I know there was
impact, right?
There was a paper on anchoring and
yeah, exactly. That's it. That's it.
Yeah, so I know that paper, but I'm wondering if there was other stuff.
Not so much, not that I'm aware of. I think it's a super important question.
Yevgeny Berzak was the first author.
Exactly, that paper. Yes, okay. Exactly. It's the only remotely, one that comes to mind. But the other one is super important, I think, because it's a very realistic scenario that we will have just one annotator, like for indigenous languages and so on, and what to do about in that case. So great question.
So Nathan, you remember a couple of years ago, we supervised a student who was looking to see whether you could automatically identify
hard cases,
possible inconsistencies. You remember Nora was working on it, and she's in Copenhagen now. Anyway, we've done more on that.
Oh, good.
And so the idea there is that for standard kinds of annotation tasks, you can go through the corpus and see whether something which has been annotated as X in one place, if there are things that are similar to X in other places, you get a similar annotation. So there are two things that are relevant there. One is that one of Irina Gurovich's students, Jan Christoph Klee, is in the final stage of writing a summary paper about this kind of work. And we've supervised a student who has looked at a range of ways of doing this for checking the consistencies of relation annotation. So I think there can be more work on this, which basically says you've got things annotated, but there may be errors, and you don't want to have to look for them just via eyeballing. And can you use something for recognizing similarity, for identifying things which are similar but may have been annotated differently?
Thanks.
Would you like to add anything, or okay? And I think Joe was next, or yes, please.
Hi, I'm Aurélie Neviol from CNRS. Actually, if I may add to this discussion, because so my group did a few studies that are probably relevant to that question, where we looked at the impact of pre-annotation on annotations. And so what we found is that having pre-annotations increases the inter-annotator agreement, because they have the same, I suppose, baseline that they start from. It also helps with annotation time, because if you have if the annotation quality is sufficient, the pre-annotation quality is sufficient, then it helps do the annotation task faster. And in the study, we also found that the annotators were actually more happy with having a good pre-annotation, because they felt that they had more support in the task. That can be one thing. And we also did another study that was answering a question that was asked in the linguistic annotation workshop a few years back, to see what was the impact, again, so of having pre-annotation on the quality of systems that could be trained on such annotations. And so we did a study where we were comparing the performance for named entity recognition of systems that were trained either on gold standard annotations created by humans, and annotations that were created using pre-annotation with different types of minimal human supervision. And we found that overall, as long as a human was involved in the annotation task, then the system performance was not statistically significant. So just to add to that discussion. Thanks for asking this great question in the panel.
Thanks. And the next question and the last question, I guess, still goes to Joe. Was it right?
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for this excellent panel. It was fantastic. I was wondering, Massimo talked a little bit about label modeling under places where there's sort of label uncertainty, or divergence in labels, and what that means for machine learning models. I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate, because machine learning models like low variance in the labels, and now we have sort of this higher variance in labels. I think that's.
Sorry, the question is whether the result of inter-annotator agreement depends on the variance of the labels, or the performance of the machine learning system.
Yeah, exactly. It's about the performance of the machine learning system under sort of variance in annotator labels, right? Because a lot of what we're trying to do is model, but the relationship between sort of the variance in the underlying labels and the ability to model, I think, is something that people are struggling with. So I wanted to ask, since you had mentioned it.
Yeah. So this work by, and I'm trying to think whether this is relevant to your question. But so the work that I mentioned, so Carletta Reitsma and the hacker did these studies in which they were basically inducing different types of noise in the data. And so what they were finding was that essentially machine learning was robust to having a certain amount of noise, although as long as the noise was completely random. But the moment in which you started observing biases, so some annotators preferring one interpretation, other annotators preferring another interpretation, then so essentially there are two types of disagreement that one of which did not affect. So basically, if the two annotators just randomly picked labels, so you could have a high disagreement, but that didn't affect the performance of machine learning. But I don't think I don't remember they actually looked at the degree, so the variability of the labels themselves, because I think those were all binary tasks. But I need to look back. It's Squibb in computational linguistics 2008, I think. But it's a good question. But I'm not sure if that particular study completely answers your question. Yeah.
Barbara, would you like to add anything?
So I wasn't completely sure about the question, to be honest. What did you, whether the machine wants the disagreement in uncertainty? Can you say it again?
Yeah, sure. So the question is basically regarding, the relationship between these annotations and levels of disagreement and machine learning models, right, and what we can model. And so I think one of the reasons why people are so into having high annotator agreement is that with respect to the model, as Massimo just pointed out, it's that if the variance is biased because there's multiple interpretations, then it's harder to model the underlying phenomenon, right? And so how do we, as people who are creating data sets, then it's difficult because, people are having difficulty to model actually the phenomenon, given that there's true, disagreement in the underlying interpretation.
Right. And so how to embrace that into modeling essentially, or the question? Yeah.
A mixture of embrace it to modeling and what is the effect on the way that we should be annotating the data, right? Right. There is a literature on trying to embrace it into modeling, and there's several ways to go about it. And currently, the best, and at least you can get rid of it a priori and try to find a goal true and model that. That's kind of the standard what we are doing right now. But there is a whole literature on. You look, the extreme case would be go and learn from the raw disagreement or raw labels, right? But we are not yet there that is a very good signal. We see better models in doing that for computer vision tasks, but arguably they are perhaps a bit simpler than language understanding tasks at sometimes, because it's mostly a classification problem. And then there is a whole literature on the goal to augmenting it with these distributions from the annotators, and we see that they have a good effect on regularizing the models, because in a way, we're still trying to cram everything into one argmax, right? In pushing it up to low entropy, essentially, while there is entropy, higher entropy, which we are essentially trying to not get. And there are ways to lower the entropy, which can be used also for calibration measures and so on. I think there is, as I'm making a plug back to the talk I gave this morning, I try to summarize a little bit on some of the methods to look into this. But my message was also, we need much more work in comparing these different methods, because the takeaway right now is there is no free lunch. There is no one method that works across all the tasks, but we need to find out what works in this case. So sorry, I hope this answers the question a little bit.
But so I don't know if you already made a plug this morning, Barbara, but yes, so we can make another plugin now. So this,
Please do. I mentioned, so the reference Uma et al. 2021. That's the key that Massimo is now telling you about. Go ahead.
So already they done it, yes. So that's what we know after many years of trying. But it's, like Barbara was saying, it's definitely not final.
Yeah, and to make this explicit, so with Massimo and Alexandra Uma, who was a PhD student in Massimo's lab, and Tommaso Fornaciari, we did this study on trying to map out some of the space and comparing methods. And there is a JAIR survey on this. It's huge. It's also still, you see, there is still, points to go back to, but it's at least one of the references we can point out.
And because it's a journal article, there is space to have a lot of.
Yeah, so it's really long. Warning, maybe even.
Thanks a lot, and thanks to Zhao for circling back to the modeling, which I didn't have the time to do. Any final comments from Margot and Bonnie?
No, I think at some point we have to close.
We do, and it breaks my heart to let all these wonderful people go, but we do have to close. So let's give them a round of applause, and thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And thanks to all of you for coming to talk about annotation in the context of negative results. And I hope to see you all after the coffee break.
Thanks for organizing, Anna, and everyone. Really, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Massimo, Bonnie, Margot, it's really great to see you. Bye.